What's up, epoxy woodworkers? My name is Corbin Dunn, and today I'm going to show you how to build this bathroom vanity cabinet that has live edge wood filled with epoxy. The cabinet is a basic frameless cabinet, meaning it does not have a face frame around the inside of it. Instead, the pieces completely overlay the plywood interior, and that helps maximize the interior space. I designed the cabinet in a 3D program called SketchUp. Check out the link in the description to download the model and some basic plans so you can make this cabinet yourself. The first thing I did was to make the drawer and door faces. I constructed an oversized mold to contain the whole area and pour epoxy with it. The mold was made out of a 3/4 inch sheet of melamine from Home Depot or another big box store. The finished door is 3/4 of an inch thick. The same with the drawer faces. So that means the mold needs to be at least 3/4 of an inch thick or higher. I made the size 2 inches higher to accommodate from the bottom and to give me some extra space. Now epoxy will stick to melamine, so we have to put something on it to prevent it from sticking. I use cheap packing tape, but another good product that people commonly use is called tuck tape or Tyvek tape, which are just a home sheathing tape that you can buy at a big box store or online. The next thing I did was to prep some live edge pieces. I harvested this wood from a tree that fell down during a storm using my Alaskan mill. Check out the link for the video of me doing that. I rough cut the pieces with a jigsaw, and then they needed to be flattened. Normally you would start with a joiner, but some of the pieces were just too wide to fit in my joiner. And so what I did is I put the pieces on a flat piece of melamine, or plywood would work too, and shimmed it underneath with some little shims and also some tape. I put some screws on the ends of the sheet to hold the piece steady, and then just ran it through my planer until it was flat on the top. Then remove it from this and plane the other side so it was perfectly parallel. I planed it to about a 1/16 inch over what I wanted. So I wanted it to be 3/4 of an inch, and I made it a 1/16 of an inch larger to give me some space to clean up after I pour the epoxy. At this point, I did some careful organization to figure out where I wanted the pieces. I marked where I needed to cut them. I took the pieces and put them in my table saw sled and held them down with some T-track slot clamps. These allowed me to safely cut the pieces, which were not perfectly perpendicular. The live edge of the wood needs to be cleaned up before you can apply epoxy, so I clean it with a wire brush on my drill to get rid of all the dust and bits that are all loose. I mixed up some quick set epoxy from Bond and brushed it on with a silicone brush. The silicone brush is great because I can reuse it again and again. I also brushed some on the bottom of the pieces, and then I put it down in the mold. I could then clamp the pieces down, and essentially I'm kind of gluing it to the base. The next step was to mix up some slow curing deep pour casting epoxy. I use the Bond deep pour because I have experience with it and it works great. I calculated the amount of volume I needed by measuring the gaps and just did a rough estimate. I needed about 1.4 gallons for my project and upped it to about 1.5 to ensure I would have enough. I tinted the epoxy with a ghost blue pigment from Black Dimond pigments. It took quite a while to actually mix it all together, and once I don't see any lumps, I knew it was all mixed really well. After about an hour and a half, the quick setting epoxy on the live edges was cured enough so that it was still tacky but pretty firm. I could then remove the clamps and the boards wouldn't move around. This is the sweet time when I can do the next pour. If I waited longer, the epoxy would harden and I would have to sand it to ensure a good bond of the next coat. I intentionally overpoured this epoxy to fill up all the little holes and defects that were found in this wood. While the epoxy cured, I started building the basic carcass for the cabinet. I broke down a large sheet of B-grade plywood with my track saw because it's easier to manage than on my table saw. There's a simple technique to cut perfect rectangles on the table saw just using the rip fence because you probably can't cross-cut large pieces of plywood. The first thing you do is you slam that factory edge against your rip fence and cut your piece to be about ½ inch larger. You can then flip it over and cut it to final size. Then the other perpendicular edge, that was the factory edge, I'll put against the rip fence and do the same thing. Cut a little bit wider and then finish cut it again. This ensures that the factory, which did a really good job of cutting perfectly perpendicular edges, will come across in my pieces and I don't have to do anything crazy to make sure it all is aligned perfectly. The basic box build is really simple. I just use biscuit joints to hold everything together. The only tricky part is cutting the biscuits for the divider. A simple technique for doing this is to clamp a scrap board and align everything up correctly. I marked the locations with a pencil and extended them a little bit so I could see where I needed to cut. I used the bottom of the tool for the relative hole locations. I shoved the biscuit joiner bottom against the clamped scrap wood and cut the holes in the bottom piece first. I can then take my other piece and flip that same edge to be also on the bottom and cut the holes in it. Because the bottom is relatively in the same plane, everything will be lined up perfectly. I use the bottom of the tool for a relative hole creation. After some test fitting, I sanded everything on the interior with 150 and 220. I'll do the exterior after assembly is completed. For the glue up, I recommend gluing one piece at a time and ensuring everything is perpendicular and straight. If you try and do more than that, sometimes you get into trouble. The drawer divider was difficult to glue up. If I was going to design this again, I might make the divider go all the way to the top. The reason it doesn't is because it needs to have some space for the sink. Instead, I didn't think about how I could clamp pressure downwards, and I realized my predicament after I started gluing it up. I thought about it for a little bit, and I came up with an easy solution. I just hammered a wedge into some pieces to apply the downward pressure, and this worked great. Still need to make the backside be clamped down, and there's an easy way to do this. I just used a 2x4 or 2x6 and clamped down the sides to apply pressure in the middle. I like to make the cabinet kick area separate from the base because you can have smaller scrap pieces to make it with and then just pocket hole it on. I only have 145 here because that's all that's going to be showing with my particular design and where I am going to put the cabinet. I demolded my pieces and did some quick hand planing on the backside to get it a little bit flatter. I then put that backside down on my table and set up my router table jig sled. If you don't have one of these jigs to do flattening of large slabs, check out my video above to make your own. It's pretty easy. I did a few shallow passes just to ensure everything was perfectly flat and in the same plane. After that, I flipped it over, aligned everything up again, and made sure the backside was perfectly flat. I also took it down to my final thickness of about 3/4 of an inch. The backside turned out a little rougher than I liked and needed some more filling up of holes and some chip out I got. So I just did a complete flood coat over it. After that dried, I took my belt sander and sanded it pretty flat again. The top side also had a few holes, and I just used some of that quick setting epoxy to fill in those little pieces and then hand sanded it with my random orbital sander to get back to being flat. At this point, I put everything aside and started to make some drawers. I made my drawers out of 5/8 of an inch thick hard maple. I am not going to go into a lot of detail on making the drawers. If you're interested in a video that shows how to make drawers using a jig like this, let me know and I'll do a complete video on making it. Once I had the drawers completed, it was time to go back to the epoxy piece and cut everything to final dimensions. I had to carefully measure things and be really careful with every cut to ensure I didn't mess up. First, I had to cut everything to overall size. I jointed one face, threw it down the table saw, and ripped it to the final size I needed. The piece was too large to fit on my table saw to do a crosscut, so I carefully set up my track saw and did a cut with that. Then I went back to the table saw and cut off the top piece, after which I could cut off the door face. Then I could cut out the 3 drawers. I ripped some 1/8 inch wide pieces from a 3/4 inch piece of maple to help with some alignment. These are Blum clip top blue motion 110° plus hinges. Check out the description to see the exact hardware and product numbers that I ordered. I measured 4 inches up on the door and then marked it on my door and transferred it over to my cabinet. I then used that location to drill the holes for the clips. The Blum datasheet can sometimes be daunting to interpret. I'm doing overlay panel cabinets, and the amount of overlay is 3/4 of an inch, or about 19 millimeters. The clip height is 0 to provide the most amount of overlay, and that indicates I need about 6 millimeters for the boring distance. At this point, I dismantled everything. I sanded with 150 and 220 on the wood, and the epoxy, I would go through the grits up to 800. I applied 3 thin coats of Osmo Poly-X. The disadvantage of this is you have to wait 8 hours between each coat, so it takes quite a while. For the body and the drawers, I decided to spray on 4 coats with my HVLP of a water-based finish. This was much faster and I could do it all and be finished about 2 or 3 p.m. in one day. Once everything was dry, I could go to the install. And the first thing I did was to hang the door. The top piece is permanently installed. I lined it to the door using that 1/8 of an inch shim that I made earlier. I then drilled some pocket holes in the top of my cabinet and just pocket hole screwed it back on. I did do a little bit of pre-drilling in areas that would go into epoxy because I didn't want to actually crack the epoxy. I started the drawer install with the bottom drawer. I could just put the runners directly on the bottom and screw them on. They're inset back about 1/8 of an inch. My preferred way of installing the faces on the drawers is to hold them in place with some clamps. I can then open the drawer and drill some pilot holes and screw them on. Now this wouldn't work for the top drawer because the top of the piece would get in the way. So I aligned everything with my shims and then I drilled the pilot hole for my knobs. I stuck the bolt into the pilot hole to hold it in place, pulled the drawer out, filled it with some clamps, tested it to make sure everything was okay, and did the same drilling of the pilot holes to hold it on. I hope you enjoyed learning how to make this river table style vanity cabinet. Give it a try. Subscribe, like, and comment. I like hearing from people and it encourages me to make more videos. Thanks everyone.